Consumer Bankers Association now filing a lawsuit against the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau following a ruling on limiting bank overdraft fees. Follows the announcement of the lawsuit. The CFPB saying Americans are, quote, sick of paying billions in junk fees. This rule is common sense and long overdue. And, quote, it's unclear why big banks are scared to be transparent with their customers. Join us right now, Consumer Bankers Association President and CEO Lindsey Johnson. Make the argument, Lindsey. Make the argument.
Well, thanks for having me. And I just want to say this is one of those services that is offered by banks to their customers as a courtesy, really helping millions and millions of consumers meet their funding needs. And if they've got an emergency funding need, if they've got a shortfall, if they just have more month at the end of their paycheck, banks are there standing in the gap for them. And before this administration ever took office, well before they ever took office, banks were innovating and they were competing like crazy to make this service more available and more cost-friendly for consumers. Since before the pandemic, starting around 2019, overdraft revenue has fallen by about 50% because banks, especially the biggest banks in the country, are offering things like 24-hour grace periods, de minimis amounts on overdraft, up to $50 in some cases, which really have brought the overall number of instances where overdraft is occurring down significantly, all to the benefit of consumers, all without rules, all without regulation. And so this just seemed like another political messaging talking point.
Well, so, Lindsey, here's the question. Do you think, and maybe it doesn't require regulation, but it requires some kind of self-regulation, which is, I think, where you're going with this to some degree, but there still is an issue, which is that there's, in some cases, as you said, there's grace periods and the like, but there's also almost, in some cases, also a lack of disclosure, or it could be made super apparent to the customer in ways that it isn't. There are some banks that'll notify you immediately. There's some banks that won't notify you immediately. The question is whether there needs to be rules of the road that are in place that everybody needs to follow.
So, one, I would just say that banks are one of the most highly regulated industries in the world. And disclosures are made up front. When you sign up for your bank account, you are given disclosures right then about what the fees are. Oftentimes, especially for debit card transactions where you're transacting for an ATM or a merchant, consumers are required to opt in to incurring an overdraft fee if they are overcharging on their account. And they're also able to opt out anytime. So having those disclosures, to your point,
I'm just suggesting,
is really important.
There are some institutions which will text you and send you a note. Say you're in overdraft land now, and you have 24 hours grace period. Those banks, great, right? That's very, very helpful and very clear. There are other banks that don't do that, and the question is whether they should. And yes, there's lots of language that everybody agrees to when they get a bank account these days, but most people do not read the entirety of it. I think we'd also agree on that. So
there's, again, 4,000 banks and 4,900 credit unions and fintechs that compete in this space. And you're right, I think it's going to force banks, as more and more of these banks follow what a lot of the leading banks have been doing, more of that competition is going to force other banks to do the similar things. What this rule did not do at the CFPB, it didn't have anything to do with that. It was the CFPB coming in, overreaching and overstepping their authority, and instituting government-set price caps on products that are offered to consumers, really not taking into account the harm that's going to come to consumers if they lose access to that important source of liquidity.
So what do you think? I mean, I know what you think the right answer is, but is there an upper limit? And if there's not an upper limit, should there then be some kind of disclosure requirement or other kinds of thing that would try to help the customer? And does there need to be an actual framework for that?
Look, again, I mean, I think that one of the most important
Lindsey,
things,
just one other point, which is this. The problem is, yes, hopefully competition forces the banks to do these types of things, because you'd think, okay, customers would try to go to institutions where they serve the customer better. But that doesn't really help the customer that gets in this sort of negative feedback loop and then all of a sudden has these massive fees that they have to pay that they didn't realize or didn't understand or didn't expect, even though, yes, they signed the piece of paper.
So I do think that consumers understand. Look, 76% of frequent overdrafters have said that they were denied a credit card. So then, and maybe currently, they don't have access to credit. We know that 26 million Americans don't have access to credit. So for a lot of those individuals, these banks are standing in the gap for them and offering this service. And they're looking at their portfolio of customers and they're trying to understand, how can we offer this across the board to our broad base of customers in a way that we can still manage our risk, in a way that still is very hopefully cost friendly to the consumer. And again, I think that this is one of these issues where the CFPB has a pretty short soundbite talking point that they can say, we've just capped overdraft at $5. But in the end, a lot of consumers may lose access to this really important safety net.